Yeah, that's fine. Let me make sure. Hear people if they pop. There we go. Thank you. Okay. Okay, folks. Thank you. Sorry. Welcome back to Building Better Media Habits. This is session 5. Somehow it's May already. Got a small group tonight, but that's great. We can have a good combo. So I wanted to talk a little bit about screen time. And we have a lot of different screens in our lives, and there's a lot of different controversies out there about screen time, and there's a lot of conversation, related to how much time different populations are spending on their various screens. So where's my cursor? Here we go. Some big questions, and then we'll kind of get into some data and then talk about some personal experiences, hopefully. So I think looking through the different articles that are written about this stuff and the research that is done on the academic side, on the scientific side, the conversation points end up kind of circling around these few things. What are we talking about when we mean screens? Maybe which screens are worse than others, which screens are we okay with, and in what context? What's actually on the screen, I think, is a big talking point, obviously, and has been for generations before we even had this screen, right? A lot of conversations about, quality, explicit material, things like that. How long, how much time are we spending on our devices? Is it actually harmful, and has it gotten worse, particularly with COVID in mind and people being at home? So on average, how much time in a day do you think the average American spends just on their phone? What do you think? Have any guesses? Just on their phone by hours. Okay, 2 and 3. 8. In the middle. Okay, so if I can, I move those to the end. So I'll show you here real quick and we'll come back. Oops, there we go. So mobile devices, which counts as both, phones and your tablets and a laptop to some extent, depending on the report. In 2021, 3.8 trillion hours in total. On average, people spent 4.8 hours. So we were kind of like right in the middle, which makes sense for an average, right? 4.8 hours a day in 2021, which was an increase of roughly 30% from 2019. One of the other things that I noticed in this report, in thinking about just, what are people doing, in the bottom screenshot here, fueled by the explosive growth of TikTok, I think, that's there's a somewhat causal relationship there, but that's kind of anecdotal, right? They're sort of saying, well, TikTok happened and then this other thing happened, so it has to be TikTok. But nonetheless, 7 out of every 10 minutes that people were on a device, they were on a social media or a phone or a video app in that same period in 2021, right? You can see 3.8 trillion hours and downloaded some 230 billion apps, spending 170 billion, an increase of nearly 20%. And this is just one study, but there's a lot, and obviously there's been a number of those in the pandemic that have come out that have underlined this idea. So 7 and 10 minutes on a mobile device, on social media in particular, or a photo video app.
how would you categorize your own screen time usage in relationship to this? Are you below the average, at the average, above? Either you know because you've tracked it, or you're just sort of guessing. We think we're below, at that average, above it.
Probably about that kind of day.
Yeah.
Day, less time on the mobile.
Yeah. So moving from screen to screen. Alice, what about you?
Yeah, I would say the same. During the on my computer all the time, but not necessarily on my phone. It's still a screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, but if you exclude computer, I mean, well, below there.
Yeah.
I don't have a tablet, and I would say, and every day I probably have a phone less than 45 minutes or an hour.
Yeah. So most of your screen time is computer. Yeah. 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 And I think obviously, generally when we hear like screen time, I think it's often couched as a lot of these studies that I wanted to kind of point to here indicate. It's usually pointed towards like kids, right? Someone came to the first our session in January and asked a couple of questions afterwards about screen time. They were a relatively new parent, or they had young kids, one or the other, and they were sort of thinking about how do we deal with this, right? And so I think in that regard, a lot of the screen time conversation is focused on young people. They're the ones who are using phones and to a lesser extent tablets more than they are computers, right? Not that they're not using computers, but they are certainly more active users with phones, right? So, if you were to search, as I have done many times and did today, to find some new, examples here, just like screen time data, screen time studies, you're going to find a lot of stuff like this, right? From very reputable institutions, very reputable organizations, some that are, sort of directly related to the health and research, and some that are a little bit more just about general wellness, political organizations, things like that, whatever, right? And you can see, a late 2019 study, of which there have been many, right? High amounts of screen time begin as early as infancy, an NIH study suggests, and you can see the subhead there: children of first-time mothers and those in home-based childcare log most of the screen time. And then some of our data points there: children's average daily time spent watching television or using a computer or mobile device increased from 53 minutes at age 12 months, sort of awkward phrasing there, to more than 150 minutes at 3 years. So suggesting, that at 1 year old, roughly 53 minutes a day, to over 2.5 hours at 3 years. And you can kind of see in that description how it goes higher. But just underlining this idea that screen time begins for most people, when they're very, very young, right? And there's obviously a lot of concern about that and questions about what does that do to development, right? What does that do to brain development? What does that do to social development, ability to interact, ability to process, things like that? And there are otherworldly numbers of studies that report on potential connections between these things, right? Potential connections. And I think that's one of the important words here. And increasingly, this concern about screen time is manifesting in schools, right? Where, especially in the division between well-supported schools or schools for wealthier children and schools that are not as supported or for poorer children. And sometimes that's public and private, and other times it's two different, types of private schools, whatever, right? But perhaps unsurprisingly, as a lot of public school systems push for every kid to have an iPad or every kid to have a tablet, or to have, a Chromebook, a very small laptop, right? a number of private schools and institutions in K through 12 are going the opposite direction, right? Because wealthy parents or donors or the teachers at these institutions are concerned about the focus on screen time, and to some extent their role in perpetuating the perceived increase in screen time. And so, you know, all of the perceived benefits about giving children technology at such a young age is potentially being outweighed by, look, these kids are on their screens way too much to begin with. Maybe they shouldn't be on a tablet doing all their work. Let's give them pencil and paper, right? Which I think is a really interesting dichotomy here, where there have been tons of examples where, you know, like the people who work for big tech companies who manufacture, sell software, things like that, who run social media companies, right? They send their kids to schools where they like don't use tech, right? But then they produce tons and tons of laptops or software that gets used in public schools, right? And that is another big talking point that emerged before the pandemic and has in many ways kind of been catalyzed further by the pandemic, obviously, because access to the internet and when you're trying to do education on Zoom and online has been further, you know, kind of complicated. So as we get a little bit older, you know, and again, a lot of this is pandemic related, but a couple of these are actually, this is like academic scientific research here. So unsurprisingly, adolescents, we're talking about, you know, 12 to 13-year-old children in the US doubled their non-school related screen time to 7.7 hours a day, right? So we talked about the average US adult being at 4.8, 12 to 13, perhaps unsurprisingly during the pandemic, 7.7 compared to 3.8 before the pandemic. So this is non-school related. So you imagine if they were on, you know, Zoom school for even 4 or 5 hours, depending on the context of that day, we're talking 10, 11, 12 hours. Importantly, study found that children of color and those from low income families obviously logged more hours on screens than their white, wealthier peers, who maybe had more resources to potentially entertain or engage with their children in ways that folks who are not in those groups could not. And again, here underlining this idea, 8 to 36-month-olds, again, odd way to phrase that, but you know, scientists. We examined children's screen time during the first COVID-19 lockdown in a large cohort. The N was over 2,000, so they surveyed or examined a pretty good cross section there. 15 labs across 12 countries. So this is not just US, right? You know, while this was exacerbated for countries with longer lockdowns, there was no evidence that the increase in screen time during lockdown was associated with socio-demographic variables such as age or SES. However, screen time during lockdown was negatively associated with SES and positively associated with child age, caregiver screen time, and attitudes toward children's screen time. So underlining again, socioeconomic status could be potentially, you know, related here, and the amount of time that you're spending on your devices might be based on what sort of resources you have in your home, in your school, in your life in general, where you're not just defaulting to a screen for connection or entertainment or engagement, right? So another question before we get into some, you know, broader conversations, what do you suspect is, you know, what is kind of recommended for kids as far as screen time? Like what do you think general, you know, in the United States, what's being recommended, how much time someone, you know, between like, I don't know, 8 and 10 should be on a screen? How many hours do you think? Okay. Other guesses?
I feel like there's some formula, you know, X amount of minutes per age or something like that.
So this is directly from the CDC. And you're right that typically there is a formula, and this is what people spend, for the record, not like what is sort of what is recommended, right? But you can see here, the top one is 8 to 10, the middle one's 11 to 14, and the last one's 15 to 18. The big number, 6 hours a day, and they're saying that's nearly, basically 4 times the amount that they sort of recommend, and what those numbers look like and what they should be doing. And there's a huge campaign by the CDC, unsurprisingly, of thinking about like screen time versus what they call lean time, right? But yeah, I had a document pulled up for, I had to reset my computer, that starts, you can go to the CDC, all sorts of public health organizations, NIH, whatever, all these different, and when they're 0 to 12 months, it's basically, it should be nothing, right? And then 12 to 18 months, it can be 45 minutes on average, right? And they get to 2 to 4, it can be 90 minutes. When they get from 4 to 6, it can be 2.5, whatever, right? But perhaps unsurprisingly, the contemporary American child goes way above that, 6, 9, and 7.5. Interestingly, I think there's a sense that the sort of tween era or age demo, right, 11 to 19 is where it sort of peaks, right, where they're sort of like capable to, and I'm just thinking about myself, I guess, and that's probably true, right, where you have access to more things, you get a little bit more freedom in the home, more more access to games or your phone or whatever, and you don't have the same ability to sort of go beyond those things without a car, without maybe some of the structure that the opportunities that you get like in high school bring to you, right? Or as you get later into middle school. I'm just speculating, but I would guess that's the case. Are we surprised by any of these numbers? In the pandemic, out of the pandemic, anything like that? Or does this generally track with what you assume screen time looks like?
I have 2 high schoolers, so yes. And not only with phones, but then during the day at school, they have a computer, they have a laptop.
Yeah.
The school provides some type of a stream, and so they have that with them all day long.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's what they use, like whether it's for whether they're working on paper or actually just looking at their textbook.
Right.
That's what they're using. So it's not, these numbers are not surprising.
As a parent, how do you feel about them having the laptop at school all the time?
I know that it's not our personal laptop.
Right, yeah.
At school, so I know they can only access certain things.
Yeah.
So I know a lot of things are locked down. So that's fine, and it makes it easier than, like, say, if they're working on something, they can then bring that home and work on it at home.
Yeah.
So I get that, but I feel like they've relaxed on phones at school.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
That's been. I remember the first week of school, I got a text from my freshman, and I thought, why does she have her phone in the middle of the day?
Yeah.
Asking me can you bring blah 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 to me? And I thought, you're gonna get in trouble. And so after school, then I said, what's going on?
Yeah.
They don't mind as long as you're paying attention and aware of what's going on. They don't mind if kids have their phones out there.
Wow. Yeah. That's was the policy before that they had to keep it in a backpack or okay.
My children are 22 and 26, and I did see that evolve from the time my oldest was in high school,
right,
until the time my youngest graduated. Some of that, as I understood, was safety and security.
Yeah.
That they had those with them in the classroom, because it started out, you had to turn them in.
Yes.
When you got to the room.
Okay.
The teacher,
Yeah.
Spot or whatever,
Yeah.
but then by the time the youngest got through, it was no more of that. I think there was a uproar with school safety and shootings and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
The kids to have the phone in case something would happen. Right.
Yeah.
You know, how to reach out to their child and things so that
Yeah.
they get involved. At least at our school, it was just pay attention. You know, don't be
Yeah. And
interested.
yeah, I'm doing some, as part, like when I reached out to the library, obviously the school system said they were going to start, they have to do media literacy programming starting this coming next school year, right? And so I've had some conversations with folks, and there's a teacher at Manual who's been developing a class based on like sort of history of technology. So we're working together, kind of like build his syllabus. And he's even kind of gone through it this year, I think, with he started the year pretty lax on phones, and then had a stretch where it was just like, this does not work. Like you have to, and was way more punitive. And now, like, as the end of the year is kind of coming around, we just talked yesterday. It was just sort of like, it's not as bad. Right. Yeah. And I think,
Yeah, I think.
oh, please.
Yeah, I think another area of concern is a lot of kids get plugged down the early path of thinking they can multitask.
Yes.
And I think that is probably one of the big deterrents
Yes.
for education, because all the studies I've read indicate that in best case scenario, you're maybe 80% effective.
Yep.
If you're trying to multitask.
Right.
It's less than that.
Yeah.
And where it comes into play is that causes them to lose focus on the topic at hand.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that certainly is true in adults as well, right? I see that in myself, right? But I think especially when we're thinking about, folks whose brains are developing, but also are just like learning how to learn and learning, basic skills related to time management and task management and things like that. I think that's so supreme. And this is obviously not even getting into all of the sort of social things that come up with when they have their phones, right? As far as what they could say to each other, what they could post, whatever, right? But just the time spent on the device. I think you mentioned having your youngest is graduating, right? It's going to graduate. That's what I thought. In talking to folks at the high school level, like it's interesting to think about like the transition from high school to college, because, I've been teaching college for a while. And obviously the tech has evolved that now everybody just has a laptop. And even when I first started in grad school, when I was teaching, not everybody even had a laptop. And I don't know if I'm just like immune or just it doesn't bother me now because everybody has a laptop and has a phone, and it's not distracting. And there's something that as people get older, they get a little bit more able to, maybe not to multitask, but to be like respectful in the fact that they're not paying attention while they're just looking at screens. Because obviously I have colleagues who are still pretty like, put all your devices away. You can't even use laptops to take notes and things like that. And given that I teach digital media, it's hard to say like, okay, put everything away, but now we're going to talk about the internet or what, so I'm pretty flexible with that stuff, but there are then certainly moments where I think for me, where it is most frustrating is that moment. If I'm talking and they're like, clearly not totally paying attention to me, like that happened before computers. So I don't blame it just on the computer. I think where it becomes an issue is like when they're in a team environment or they're doing like a project together in the classroom, they've been divided up and I'm not leading the conversation, and, they engage with one another very briefly, and then they're all just on their phones and not necessarily, maybe they've partially completed the work or it's something that they're going to do outside of the class, but that moment of like using the phone to like fill the time, right? Where I don't know these people, or I don't really like them, or I don't want to talk to them, or they don't want to talk to me. So I'm just immediately on my phone. I think that's the moment that it gets to me a little bit more, just because I want them to be respectful to each other, but they might not even view it as disrespectful to each other. That's the thing. I'm standing there thinking like, wow, you're being such a jerk on your phone while your two other teammates are doing this, having this conversation. And maybe the other people don't even think about it because, in 30 seconds, they're going to pull their phones out too. do you think, with high schoolers, are you concerned about screen time? Like, is this something that you talk about in your house? I'm just curious how that plays out.
Yeah, we do talk about it. It's hard to shut it down.
Yeah.
Because I know they're actually I know they're using it for fun, but I also know that they're also using it for school, or they're using it to communicate with their friends. So there are goods and bads, I guess.
Yes.
Positive and negative. But I do from time to time say, all right, dinner is one time. Like,
Yeah.
everybody's phones are down.
Yeah.
Whatever you do with them, wherever you put them, everybody's phones are down.
Does that work usually? Okay.
Yeah. Now it may be like they're looking at it until everybody's sitting down at the table.
Right. Like literally the moment they pick up a utensil, they're like switching. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but they will do that. Like they set them all down. Like if we're all, we have family nights every so often.
Yeah.
So phones are down for that. But it's concerning, but it's just such a part of everybody's lives.
Right.
That's a part.
Well, and I think that gets to, and I've got a bullet point on one of the slides later, like we've had this concern, like before our phones, like, there's concern about computers. Before computers, we're concerned about video games. Before that, we're concerned about TV, right? There's always a thing that we're concerned about. There were moral panics about like comic books and radio, right? Like that part of it always exists. But we obviously just keep adding things to it. I obviously this is something that I think about a lot, not only because I teach this, but now since I have a 14-month-old, and we I think every probably new parent goes through this, right? Like we've got like a hard line. We're not gonna do this. We're not gonna let him look at screens, and then he's having a complete meltdown about something, and we realize that 10 minutes of Toy Story 2 actually does help him chill out. And it's like, damn, that really does work. And then I see some of these data points about like the effects, and then it's just like, man, my parents let me watch TV all the time forever, and I'm a college professor, so maybe it doesn't matter at all, right? And that goes to show there have been a lot of studies recently. I just pulled this one. Even since the pandemic has started, there's been a lot of like, not research saying like there's no evidence, but just saying that a lot of these studies that draw, that there is a cause and effect relationship between screen time and X, whether that's obesity or, slower brain development or lower IQ or any of those things, right? There have been a pretty large number, as surprising to me actually, of studies that have come out that have said, look, maybe, we can make the case that like, yes, if you let your kids look at a screen for 18 hours a day, yes, that's bad. Don't do that. But that these average numbers of screen times, even above average, even the last paragraph here, like families place value on positive activities such as exercise, socializing, and sleep, as when these are replaced by screen time, a child's well-being is effective. Obviously, if you are more active, you're more social than just looking at a screen, sure, yes. But there's a sense that if you have a healthy mix, even maybe a slightly, below average mix of exercise and an above average mix of screen time, that there's not like a direct, that's an immediate, you're going to have heart disease or obesity or whatever, right? And of course, as we talked about at the very beginning, this is the slide I moved to, it's not just in kids, right? There's all kinds of discourse and reporting about other types of screens, right? Whether we're, so much of it is focused on kids and the phone, but there's also, gaming. They're increasingly, or at least over the last 5 years, tons and tons of studies about binge watching, like on streaming television, right? Because you have so many of these things at the tip of your finger with Netflix and Hulu and all of those things. So there's tons of reporting about that. Like even calling it binge watching is a signal that this is a negative behavior, right? There's connotations connected to binge eating, right? And one that's more in the wheelhouse of news and information, and it might be a little bit more applicable to some of the things we've talked about in recent months here, is something that's certainly emerged in the pandemic. And maybe you've heard of this and maybe you haven't, but that is the phenomenon of doom scrolling. Is anyone familiar with doom scrolling? Have we heard of this before? So this is essentially a thing that you probably do in some form or another. It's the connotations are, or the general suggestion of this is at night, like right before bed, but it can be in any part of the day where you essentially, sit down and you want to kind of know what's going on in the world, and you're probably on social media looking at news. This is in the context of like, you're looking for news, not just like you're wasting time on social media, but that you pull your phone out most likely to check the news and, oh man, COVID cases are up 42%. X number of people, have died in Ukraine today. A celebrity that you like died. The Supreme Court is going to do some pretty controversial bad stuff, right? And you're seeing article after article after article about that. And maybe you're clicking those links and you're going into other things and you're looking things up on Wikipedia and you're reading reactions from your friends and the people that you follow. And they're all posting the same article or posting the same, kind of memes about social justice or whatever, right? Some historian quote or something. And then you realize like 45 minutes have gone by and you wanted to go to bed at 9:30 and now it's 10:15 and you've just been literally scrolling through the doom of the world, right? So this is a phenomenon that's a little bit more contemporary and I think interesting because oftentimes when we talk about screen time or we talk about even something like television dating back to the mid 20th century, there's this idea that you're wasting your time, right? That you're watching something stupid or something that's bad for you on television, or your kids are just looking at dumb YouTube videos or whatever it is, right? But there's also, and we've talked a little bit about this, right, a way that a lot of your screen time is dedicated towards like, I'm trying to be informed, right? But because of the infrastructure of the internet and social media, it will just keep giving you that stuff, right? And if you feel, sort of manic or panicked about what's happening in the world when a major news event happens, and I just speaking personally, like I definitely have done this week when the memo or the draft Supreme Court decision got leaked and all the news was coming out and all the, articles and commentary, right? Spent 35 minutes just reading article after article, analysis after analysis, right? And then just felt awful, right? Just felt awful about what I was reading, what people were saying about the state of the world, what could happen after that, right? And obviously during the pandemic, this was is a very palpable thing, especially when it feels like you can't control any of it, right? But you can just get more and more information about it, right? So maybe we didn't know this concept before, but does this experience sound familiar to you? Pulling up a device, whether it's computer, phone, and just keep going, right? We've all probably done this, right? How common would we say this of an experience this is for you? More than you would like? Yes. Yeah, I think for me, and again, I'm just speaking for myself, but I like to think that I'm reflective about my practices because I teach stuff like this, but I will always, where I get in trouble every time is that I sit down in bed and I like turn on my alarm for the next morning and I have my book on my lap and I'm like, I'm gonna read 15 pages before I go to bed. And then I will look at something, right? I will decide before I put my phone down to look at one thing, and then 23 minutes go by and then I feel like crap. And maybe I can, a lot of the articles about this are, there is scientific research that says like you shouldn't look at a screen like the hour before you go to bed, right? It just like the brain waves, the attention, all of that. So when you're doing that, when you're looking at your phone right before you go to bed, and you're kind of shoveling in all of this just oftentimes real factual information about what's happening in the world, but probably doesn't make you feel particularly good, that elevates that idea of your brain just being on overdrive when you're trying to go to sleep. So yeah, anyone else want to share how often this happens to them? What it feels like when you're doing this?
I think generally happens when you're doing a search for something and it gives the other list of types of things.
Yeah.
And that it's tempting to run down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, and I find for me, and again, like there's the perception or the stereotype of this is that like you're mindlessly looking at your phone, but oftentimes for me, it's like I'm reading a news source or a website that has, like the Times or the Journal or whatever, that they have published 75 stories that day or whatever, or 50 stories in the last 2 weeks about this topic. And it's so easy to just be like, oh, okay, well, I missed this one because they've published so many. And now, you're reading and you're clicking. And I also have there's tons of different, tools where you can save things for later or whatever. And that's my problem is I'll save things for later and then I'll pull them up and it's like, oh, wow, I saved 14 things today. And I was like, well, I got to read them because if I don't, then there's going to be 14 tomorrow, and then I'll go like a week and not read anything. And I'll log into that. And it's like, I saved like 77 articles this week. And I have some that are like 7 years. I'm just never going to read them that were like breaking news stories. But yeah, you get caught up in if you're interested in something. And especially I think if you feel like, oh, this is really bad. I need to know more about it so I can, feel like I can, what can I do? Or how should I feel about it? That's maybe not bad. And you just keep finding other bad things. I don't know. What do you two think?
I have, fall into that trap too, but when I do fall into that trap and I realize what I've done, and then search out a positive story.
Yeah.
Of
Yes.
some other completely different topic.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with what garbage I was just reading, garbage in the fact that it's depressing.
Right. Right.
So like go find something that's completely opposite and off that topic just to like come out of it.
Yeah.
That's the only, for me, like how I just make it stop.
Yeah.
Make it stop. Go find something else that's happy or, some good thing that some person did.
Yes.
Somebody at a ball game who gave a kid a ball and the kid was crying. And, just silly
Yes.
things. But
Yeah.
something that's more uplifting, so.
Well, and that's often like recommended, and I'll have some recommendations at the end, but that's often one of the pieces, like, find something that makes you feel good, right? Or, find something that will make someone else feel good and like send it to them, right? Just having that moment of like, oh, I hopefully made someone else feel a little bit better, so I feel better, right? Alice, do you have any thoughts?
Well, to see, one problem is that you read something and maybe you want to see, well, this is how factual is
Yep.
this? So then I would search for other articles to either back it up or refute it, whatever the case may be. So it just, it's the rabbit hole thing, like you said.
Yeah, and I think that's where all of this whole system is so interconnected, right? Where like, a lot of the weeks we come in here when we have these sessions and it's like, seek out the most accurate information, like fact check it. And that's like, well, not only does that take a lot of time, but like if you are interested in it, now you read 5 articles about it. And yeah, that's why like it's so hard to do, right? And even if you use all the tools that we have that like filter things to you and you trust certain news sources, yeah, there are just certain times. And I think it's silly to say that, the times you live in are worse or better than the times you didn't live in. It just, obviously the last couple of years have been pretty rough as far as just a wave of horrible information at all times.
I think another factor that comes into play there are some of these search engines like Google or that have algorithms built in that
Oh, yeah.
And it steers in that direction. So, the algorithms are actually reinforcing the focus.
Absolutely. Yeah. They're making you feel worse, right? They're making you, I mean, the fundamental effect of so many of the social media infrastructures that we encounter, or the tech infrastructures that we encounter, is just like people feel worse, they feel angrier, right? And that is like, we see that out in the world, right? Where it's very difficult for people to have a conversation with folks who disagree with them politically, because you're sort of hyped up by the things that you see online and on television. And I've got an example from the TV side here momentarily. But I know for me, when I get into these cycles of doom scrolling, then I decide, and I've gotten better at like, okay, I did a really poor job of that. So for however long I can, like, I'm just not gonna look, I'm not gonna read anything, I'm not gonna read any more about it. I'm done. I understand what's happening. It's bad. It makes me feel bad. And to a certain extent, I cannot control that event. And I will then focus on other interests, like oftentimes, not that sports aren't political, but I've gotten into other sports that I was not into before the pandemic, right? I was just like, I can put all my attention to European soccer in a way that I could not before, because I was just like, I'm not reading all these political stories that I read before, whatever. Then I feel bad, because it's like, I teach this stuff and I'm telling students to like read and know what's going on in the world. And then I'm like trying not to know and you get in that guilt of like not engaging, but then you feel bad. It's a really vicious cycle if you want to be informed, right? Unsurprisingly, we know this, but just to underline, right, that like screen time really encourages the path of least resistance. And that's a quote from the former Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who's written a couple of books about this kind of idea and, trying to be happier around screen time. But we know phones, apps, games, social media, all of that stuff are using what they call persuasive design, right? To attract us, with a combination of like motivation, ability, and triggers, right? That, our motivation is that we want to connect or we want to acquire information, and they create technology or scenarios that make it really easy for us to do those things. And the tech, especially on the tech side, it does all of that for us, as we were just talking about. And then things like notifications and reminders and auto plays, like lure us further into those ecosystems where we're just sort of passively, what they call in the tech industry, a frictionless environment, right? Where you have to basically do nothing, and it just pushes things to you, guides you through the process, right? So one thing that I find interesting, though, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, is that we do kind of create these hierarchies as to what constitutes good and bad screen time. And to some extent, that is great. And we're going to talk about that and we think about some solutions. But, as someone who writes and does a lot of research about TV, I think it's fascinating that there's been so much attention paid to like, well, if you watch 3 episodes of The Office on Netflix, that you've seen 3 times, like that's a binge watch, and maybe that's unhealthy. But if you watch like one football game that is 4 hours long with commercials, no one ever says like you were binging the NFL, right? It was just like, you're only binging television, right? It's because we have an interesting, cultural hierarchy that sports are often certain sports are deemed like important, and watching television is often maybe not, right? So I find that really interesting. But excessive consumption of news, as we just talked about, is rarely viewed negatively. But in the social media era, with COVID, with the political environment, right, we see the emergence of things like doom scrolling. There's also research that shows like psychologically human beings are predisposed to look for and think about and respond emotionally and psychologically to threats, right? That even when we feel like things are maybe going well for us in our lives, interpersonally, whatever, there's a tendency to maybe think about what could go wrong, right? And there's a very recent story that underlined how this idea plays out, not on social media or not in a tech world, but on television. New York Times did this extensive 3-part investigation analysis of Tucker Carlson's rise at Fox. And one of the most interesting anecdotes, and I'll just sort of summarize it here, is how the producers of the show, and they brought in some new folks over the last, basically in the Trump era, really started to pay attention to the quarterly Nielsen ratings, which you actually get ratings reports from Nielsen's for 15-minute chunks and even minute-by-minute chunks. And they really started to pay attention to, okay, how can we block out our show like 15 minutes at a time and really see what the audience is responding to? And unsurprisingly, they view this as like a really data-driven, smart approach to give the audience what they want. But the screenshot here on the right side, you can see here, segments featuring Fox's own reporters consistently drew lower ratings, especially if they were covering stories the audience deemed unfavorable to Trump. So did guests who leaned left or simply staked out individual viewpoints. But immigration was a hit. Coverage of migrant caravans, if you remember that in the 2018 midterms, became a Fox mainstay, with one correspondent even embedded with refugee groups. Fox executives wanted to focus on, quote, the grievance, the stuff that would get people boiled up, said one current Fox employee. Quote, they're coming for you, the blacks are coming for you, the Mexicans are coming for you. This idea, again, that even when you have, a Republican president, Republican-controlled Senate, House, et cetera, right, that there's still all of these horrors around the corner, right? That even though, we're winning politically, there's all these horrible things to get people mad about, right? So it's not just social media. This stuff is obviously playing out on television as well. There we go. So one of the other challenges here, I think, especially when we think about our own habits, but maybe particularly with children, that all of our tech is so integrated and converged that they don't just do one thing. It's hard to just say, no phone, no computer, as Alice was saying, right? Like when they're using their computer to do homework, like that, it's hard to just be like, we don't use computers, right? Or like, there's a sense that especially our mobile and computing devices do so many different things. Various platforms like YouTube might have a lot of educational material, but then also a lot of, garbage or stuff that parents don't want their kids watching. Phones, tablets can be used in all sorts of educational contexts, getting information, doing things like Duolingo or Prodigy, which are language and math-oriented apps, right, that are supremely helpful for education, right? Not just for K through 12, like tons and tons of people all over the world use Duolingo to learn new languages all the time, right? So again, it's not a black and white situation, which we all know, but I think that makes it harder to figure out what is the best way to have a healthier relationship with our screens, right? So a few suggestions that are culled from my experience and experts in the field, it's all dependent on how far you want to take it, right? Obviously, we can say, I'm going to get a flip phone. I'm going to throw my smartphone in there. Like once a year, I'm just going to buy a flip phone. Like I don't need this, it's stupid. And I don't use my phone that often in general, but I still feel like I use it too much. But that's one approach. If you don't want to do that, right, there are all sorts of built-in, tools increasingly, especially in the Mac ecosystem, where you can set, timers, time limits on your individual apps on certain things throughout the day. You can build schedules. You can do way more do not disturb functions, right? That allow you to have a little freedom from your tech. There's also a software that I have purchased at various points in my life called Freedom, which basically you pay for, this is kind of part of the penalty or the pleasure, depending on how you look at it, I guess, where it will block you from certain things. So like I have it installed on all my devices and I can set it up if I've got a deadline or I just feel like my habits are a little where I don't want them to be. I can say block me from all social media, and then I can even put in specific sites, like, because you can block yourself from social media and then like obviously come up with a workaround. So then it's like, I need to block myself from ESPN.com, or I need to block myself from New York Times or whatever, right? And part of it is I've paid for this, so I'm going to use it. There's other ones that you have to pay every time you try to access the site. So if you say block me from Twitter, and then you log on to Twitter and it says, okay, do you really want to open Twitter it's $3. And then you basically penalize yourself. So then you feel really, really bad about your behavior, which is somewhat effective, but also then kind of further stigmatize it, right? Obviously, we've talked a little bit about like creating barriers, right? Digital and physical, putting your screens in the other room at certain parts of the day, not taking it to bed with you. But if you use them as an alarm, then that creates complication. Another approach is to organize all your apps on your devices in folders and know that you can, add like a screen time for all of those, or even hide them from the front page. So you're not, you have to do a little extra work to get them, right? And obviously, like maybe keeping them away from work or family spaces. A lot of the resources I pulled up before today said, at work, like putting your phone on you like charge it somewhere else, like away. If you have to be at a computer, then you also don't need your phone to, trying to like minimize the number of screens you're looking at. One of the things I found really effective over the last couple of years is I've just turned off all notifications. So I get no notifications on my phone outside of missed calls. And I generally have do not disturb on throughout the day anyway, so that I don't really care. I think my wife is the only person I have that breaks through all of those things. And that's only because she said like, hey, you can't have me on do not disturb. Because I did for a while, and I missed like 6 calls over the course of a few weeks or whatever. So, some of the, obviously in certain cases, you need your phone, right? As we were talking about. So that's a strategy, especially for social or email, right? I think in my job, like email in particular, I just like, I cannot, and I still open it, right? But I just don't get notifications. There's a lot of advice about embedding your screen time into more active activities, right? Like instead of texting or DMing or whatever, people, your friends, your family, doing actual phone calls or FaceTime if you have to, but then going on a walk while you're doing it, or doing it while you're washing the dishes or laundry, so you're not just literally like sitting, right? And you have a little bit different type of communication style. Swapping doom scrolling for more connective or interactive activity, like we mentioned, like finding something and sending it to somebody, which again kind of undercuts with the previous point about like don't text somebody. But if it's 10 o'clock at night or whatever, right, then maybe it's okay in that context. There's a lot of unsurprising language around like not using these things, right? So fasting, detoxing, all of those things, taking days or weeks or months off of certain platforms or certain screens is something that I, at least for myself, have found really effective, where I decide, I'm not going to use Twitter for the next 2 months, right? Or I'm not going to look at my tablet, or I'm not going to do this for a certain amount of time just to feel like I'm away from it for a while, right? And obviously there's a number of different books and how-to guides about this. A couple that I really like: How to Break Up with Your Phone and How to Do Nothing, especially How to Do Nothing. That's a really great book, just in general. But also being accountable to someone, like talking to someone when essentially, again, I don't want to put it all the time in this sort of language, but like having a screen time sponsor, essentially, right? Like if you feel like you're not doing well with your screen time, being able to share with somebody that you're not feeling well about it and talk to them about how they can help you. That's been effective for me at times, where I will ask my wife to change my passwords on all the social media that I don't want to look at, because I've been, especially like during the election or stuff like that, I'm just like, I cannot read this crap anymore, but I absolutely will. So you have to like change the Twitter password to something I'll never know, change my Instagram password, like change my LinkedIn password. I don't care. I could run into a political story on LinkedIn. So for kids, I think there's other slightly different advice, although all that advice I just gave, I think applies. Oftentimes the 3 things I see obviously that come up: time, like literally the amount of time, but also the quality of the content. This is another thing to underline. There's so much educational and interactive and age appropriate content that does exist on a screen, whether that's a television, video game console, an educational game that they can play on their computer or on their phone, right? All of those things are okay, right? Like, and very valuable in a lot of ways. But a lot of the advice that I've read as a new parent and in teaching this stuff is really focused on, it being on the parents, obviously, to kind of seek out what those things actually are in the context of, you know, when you're looking at the app store and it says, or you have the category of like educational, right? And are those things like actually educational, right? Are they actually educational for the level of child, you know, your child's level? What are they doing? Like, is there a level of interactivity that is getting their brain going, right? And then a lot of the advice is focused on like using the screens together, right? In a productive way, where, you know, watching things with kids or playing things with kids, so it doesn't just feel like a solo experience for them, where they feel completely, well, they might not feel it actively, but they're alienated from, you know, community and social experience. And then there's a lot of debate about like screen time as a reward. And that's certainly something that I've talked with other like new parents, friends who have kids that are a little older, like, how do you balance screen time? Is that something you use as a reward? Is it something that you punish them from? Like that whole thing is obviously really complicated, because trying to stigmatize or not stigmatize the screen is really interesting. I don't know. Thoughts, you know, potential areas of that, any of these that you might pursue, or things that you've tried, you know, beyond what we've discussed to try to improve your relationship to your screen?
Two questions.
Yeah.
Only available all platforms, or is it only available on?
I believe it's both. Yeah, I believe you can get it on PC as well. Yeah.
Oh, back to your two books. Next screen.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. Let me.
What is the author? What are the authors on this?
I clicked the wrong thing. Now I'm over here. Sorry. My screen went blue. There we go. Catherine Price is How to Break Up with Your Phone. And then Jenny Odell. Yes. Yeah. And the top one is a little bit more kind of, I would say, conventionally self-helpy, but that's not bad necessarily. And this one, How to Do Nothing, is a little bit more philosophical, like literally how to do nothing. But it's in a response, she wrote it as a response to just like feeling like she was addicted to her phone and social media in particular. Yeah. So I would recommend both of those. Obviously there's tons and tons of like habit-oriented ones, some of which I've read, because I'm sort of a big habit person trying to establish that routine. And I don't know, you know, like it's really easy. I think this, to that point, like Catherine Price, I was looking her up today because I read this book a few years ago and I couldn't think of it. I knew it had like a snappy title, but her website, you know, she like has a whole like self-help guru kind of like, you can buy all these different other guidebooks and tutorials to like help you with this process. And that doesn't invalidate the book, but she's, you know, turned it into more of a self-help brand. But yeah, other thoughts?
It was funny that you said you had your wife change your password.
Yes.
I used to do that to my kids.
Yeah.
When they were in high school and it was finals time or whatever, but that was back when there was only Facebook and Twitter. And
Yeah.
The 10 other apps.
Yeah.
That they're on now, but I made them come to me, but.
Yeah.
A question more than, have you ever seen, because my husband grew up in the South and I grew up here.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen a study as it relates to screen time based on where you live? So because he grew up in the South, he was able to be outdoors.
Yeah.
12 months a year.
Great question. Yeah.
And I grew up here.
Right.
In the Midwest.
Right.
Where I was not.
Yeah.
We both grew up in the days before cable TV.
Right.
So I remember distinctly playing in the basement.
Yeah.
Roller rinks, you know, all that
Yeah.
stuff. But we were definitely forced indoors.
Yeah.
And our kids have grown up in the
Yeah.
Midwest as well. And so, you know, when you're, you know, he was always like, well, we was always playing football. I was always
Yeah.
like, well, yeah, that's South Carolina weather. That's
Right.
Not,
Right.
That's not Illinois.
Yeah.
January, February.
Yes.
Where you know, it may be an easier parenting decision to.
Yeah.
Because like you said, I grew up watching TV.
Yeah.
My parents parents, it was no big deal.
Right.
I have a college education. I remember coming home, putting my now 22-year-old watching Dora.
Yeah.
And I unloaded the groceries from the store.
Yeah.
You know, and she's graduating soon cum laude.
Right.
So, you know, but because of those situations and, you know, I don't know. It was just interesting.
No,
like,
that's
something that exists, like.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I haven't explicitly, I've definitely read and, you know, seen studies that are like geographic in nature, but it's a little bit more just like, you know, we're looking at a specific region
Right.
of the world, not like,
Right.
you know, a cross sectional, like here's Illinois versus South
Right.
Carolina.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think that certainly those environmental factors are huge, right? I think,
Right, I guess that's the question, like,
yeah.
environmentally, right?
Yes, because I think even they were talking, the couple of the studies I read for today was underlining, right, like as one of the headlines said, beyond socioeconomic status, you know, folks who go to like in-home daycares or whatever, where, you know, it's just somebody at their house
Right.
and they've got TVs or whatever, they're more predisposed to consume on screen. So that would stand to reason that, you know, environmental factors like climate, right? Yeah, because I mean, I'm from the Midwest too, and I was certainly, and I think some of it is also, and this is somewhat conjecture, but just shifts in like, you know, like neighborhood patterns and like perceptions of safety, right? Like I think we all have a perception that like when we were kids, however old we are, like our parents were just like, see you at 5 or whatever, like, you know, and I grew up in a really, really rural area. And so that was certainly the case where my parents were fine to, let me watch TV, but we're also fine to just be like, see you later. Yeah. Yeah. And it was not a problem at all. And just thinking about like changes in parenting and perceptions of parenting and safety, I think like that has shifted, which I think, you know, there's been a lot of reporting and books over the last few years about all of the cascading factors that have made being a parent in America really difficult, right? From economic to childcare to all these different things where like, you know, you have all these things at your disposal and this sort of nannification of everything, but then you're also terrified that you've given them all this technology, but you don't really have a choice because you're both working parents and that's been sold to you as a great thing. And it is a great thing, but now you can't afford. I mean, my wife and I were very anti-screen and we still are, but you know, we are both professors at Bradley. I mean, our income is above average, significantly above average, but we still literally cannot like afford like just daycare 5 days a week, right? So there are days like today where I was home with my son and he was absolutely demonic, right? And it was just like, you're gonna watch Toy Story for 15 minutes while I like take the trash out, go to the basement to flip the laundry, as you're saying, right? And sometimes that goes to like, it's on in the background for 30 minutes and for 10 of that minutes, he's like destroying the room. And for 10, he's paying attention. And the other 10, he's eating. It's like, well, is that all screen time? Or is that just, the TV's on and he's in the room, you know? And you think like, yeah, I just, today, as I was building this slideshow, I was like, man, now I feel bad again, right? Like that I've let him watch Bluey or I let him watch Turning Red or whatever, right? And it's like, I don't know, he's not going to remember any of this. It doesn't matter, right? And so I think that part of it is so challenging to wrestle with, that like you want as a parent, as you know, we all know, like give them everything, but then immediately feel bad about the things that maybe you have. It just, that is such a difficult thing to wrestle with. And then, yeah, when I think a couple of the articles I was reading that were just like New York Times articles, the one about like the contrast between private schools and public schools as far as tech, it started with a really great lead anecdote where it was a relatively small town, but like a whole group of parents of like, I think 8th graders or maybe early high school students. It was like 100 parents got together in the school, and basically said like, we all need to band together to like stop their phone usage. Not even like at school, but just like we have to, if one of us does it, then we're just the asshole, and all of our, all of our kids' friends are like, well, we still have ours. So we have to like have neighborhood meetings where like we're all in, like blood oath, we're not giving them the phone, which I thought was really interesting, but is hard to pull off, right? Because there's all these social pressures of giving them the devices, right, at that young age, right?
So my daughter, here for started fifth grade, she had to start riding the bus home from school.
Yeah.
Very first day of school, the bus dropped her off in the wrong place.
Yeah.
But luckily, it wasn't too far from where she was supposed to be dropped off, and she's going to supposed to be dropped off with her friend, who's also on the bus with her.
Yeah.
So she gets dropped off, her friend, blah, 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 long story short, she was fine, everything was fine. But as a parent, I was like, no, my kid needs, I need to know where she is, because there was a moment of, 20 minutes or so where I thought, where is she and what's going on?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
she's only a fifth grader.
Right.
So fifth grade, she got a phone.
Yeah.
And we kept telling ourselves what's going to happen to her, not going to happen to her. There's no reason for her
Yep.
to have a phone that young.
Yeah.
But that first wrong drop off from the bus, I thought, well, I guess so. And so then when my younger one started fifth grade, like, oh, well, now.
Yep. Yes.
She needs a phone.
Yes.
But they have come in handy.
Yeah.
Over the years, now that the older one is driving and
Right.
they go to places together, and it's like, well, yeah, that's help to have. I get here and I text a hey, don't forget that I'm late tonight, so you guys go ahead and do dinner. One of the three of them, my husband or one of my kids will see that and hear the message.
Yeah.
No, but
Yeah.
it's just so, I think that's the problem. It's just so easy.
Yeah.
It's just right too, then, because we were like that too.
Yeah.
Fifth grade, because we were playing sports, we both work.
Right.
We had babysitters.
Or other people are picking them up, whatever. Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
and so it was that fear of, if I can't get you, but I never know what's happening in this rural community that you referred to. My friends do it, and my sister too.
Yep.
There's more accountability from each other.
Yeah.
By, and either you're related to everybody, or,
Yes.
just everybody knows everybody.
Yeah.
And so there's more accountability from a social standpoint.
Yes.
than the village thing.
Right.
But when you're in the city, you don't know.
Right. Yeah. And even if you have like a good, close like neighborhood, but like the school is 15 minutes away or whatever, like there's so many dynamics there that are. Yeah. And I think that's like, it's so hard to like point to real cause and effect here, right? Because there's so many things that we can point out that are immensely positive about these developments, right? From like very, very small day-to-day things to, just the scale of access to knowledge and the things that, I think that it's, the anxiety over it is real and well-founded, that again, like we shouldn't let kids or anybody shouldn't just sit on their phone all the time. And I'm sure we all had the experience in our lives where people are important to us are paying too much attention to the TV or to the phone or the computer, whatever, right? Like that is annoying, but it's not just the tech that's done that. There are these things that are built into phones and social media that make it worse than it was before, but it's just this accelerated extension of like what we've always kind of experienced, right? I mean, it was when I was growing up, when we had TV, or video games, right? It's just like video games was the big one. I didn't even really play games that much, but just all the stigma around gaming, and that now, at Bradley, like one of our most popular majors and prestigious majors is like game development, right? Like it's legit, it's a real industry, all that stuff. So all this stuff is really complicated. I think so much energy just gets put towards it because of the kids part, right? Like as soon as you put it in the context of children, then it's like, this is a crisis. No way, yeah.
She's constantly, we're at work.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe it's something like, I don't know, earth shattering or.
Right.
You know, anything like that. But I don't know, I don't pretend to know what she's doing, but
Yeah.
it's, I like the fact that you point out, it's not just kids, there are.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and I think I find myself, like every time I will think like, man, my students were just all like looking at their computers and their phones today. I'm so irritated. Then I'll have to go to a meeting on campus that I don't want to be at. And within 10 minutes, I'm like, I'm going to check my email. And, like, and then I've got my computer up and I am not there. Right. And I'm just like, yeah, and I think there was obviously during the pandemic, a lot of conversation about like Zoom fatigue and things like that. And part of my job, I was on Zoom all the time. And I did find it fatiguing, but I don't know. I enjoyed it from a teaching standpoint, only in that, like, not seeing people not paying attention to you is kind of nice. Like there's a weirdness where you're just like, look, I already know you're not paying attention, but like we're all in here and I'm going to do the thing that I'm here to do. And when you would actually like get someone to respond, it was like crazy relief. Whereas I think this school year was much harder coming back in person, especially in the fall, when I was like, oh yeah, this is what it looks like when 22 people are just not paying attention to you, right? It's very annoying. When you're in a digital sphere, you're like, of course nobody's paying attention. But when they're not. Yeah. This one is really interesting, and we could talk for ages, as we could about all of them. But our next one is June. I just looked it up on my phone, June 2nd. So we've got two folks here, regulars, things you would like me to cover, want to talk about. I've got other ideas, but I just want to throw it to you.
Trying to identify material that's been peer reviewed.
Oh,
And,
well, I can talk about that.
doing that,
Yeah.
Help them do it, in today's political environment, let's farm from that.
Yeah, great. That's definitely something to think about, and I can definitely talk about that process in evaluating information. Great. Well, thank you all, as always. Thanks for coming. Thanks for staying around to chat, being patient with our tech issues.
On our YouTube page, the
There we go.
library's